When I was 17 during my senior year of high school, I landed my second ever job at McDonald's. I didn't know what to expect. Fast food jobs were notorious for being chaotic, but I needed the money. My parents insisted I start saving up for my own expenses, and I wanted a bit of independence. Plus, it felt like a rite of passage. Everyone I knew had worked in fast food at some point. The first few weeks were tough. The pace was relentless, and the constant stream of customers was exhausting. At first, I struggled to keep up with the demands of the kitchen during the rush hours. Orders flew in faster than I could comprehend, and it seemed like no matter how hard I tried, I was always a step behind. The other employees, seasoned veterans of the McDonald's grind, moved like clockwork, their hands deftly assembling burgers and filling fries as though it were second nature. But I was determined to figure it out. Over time, I got the hang of it. My hands learned the rhythm of flipping burgers and wrapping sandwiches, and I could recite the menu in my sleep. As the days passed, I started to enjoy myself. Most of my coworkers were friendly, and we formed a bond forged in the chaos of lunch and dinner rushes. The camaraderie we shared in those frantic moments made the job almost fun. Then there was Joe. Joe was hired a few weeks after me. He was older, probably in his early 20s, but something about him seemed off. He wasn't particularly loud or disruptive, but he had an air about him that set me on edge. It was nothing concrete, just a nagging feeling I couldn't shake. Joe and I worked a handful of shifts together, but we rarely spoke. He wasn't rude or anything, but there was a distance to him. I figured he was just shy or introverted. One night after finishing my shift at 9 p.m., I clocked out and stepped into the cool evening air. The parking lot was dimly lit, with only a few flickering streetlights illuminating the rows of cars. It was the kind of quiet that felt almost eerie, the kind where every sound seemed amplified. I walked toward my car, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes, when I noticed someone standing by the curb. It was Joe. "Hey," he said, stepping forward. Hey," I replied, caught off guard. I hadn't seen him inside the restaurant that day. "I need a favor," Joe said. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "I'm stuck here. Could you give me a ride home?" I hesitated. I hadn't planned on playing chauffeur that night, but he seemed harmless enough. Besides, he was a coworker. What was the worst that could happen? "Sure," I said finally. Joe climbed into the passenger seat of my car and gave me his address. As I pulled out of the parking lot, he started chatting. He wasn't a bad conversationalist. In fact, he was surprisingly polite, asking about school and how I liked the job. But there was an undertone to his voice, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't what he said, it was the way he said it. His words felt calculated, as though he was choosing them carefully, like he was trying too hard to come across as normal. The drive to his house wasn't long, but it felt like an eternity. By the time I pulled into his driveway, my unease had morphed into relief. "Thanks," Joe said as he got out. "No problem," I replied, watching him disappear into the house before driving off. A week later, I finished another night shift. As I walked to my car, I glanced around the parking lot. Most of the other cars were gone, but one caught my eye. It was parked in the far corner, backed into a space. Joe's car. I hadn't seen him at work that day. Why was he here? I shook off the thought, convincing myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was waiting for someone. I got into my car and started the engine. As I pulled out of the lot, I noticed the headlights of Joe's car flicker on. He was leaving too. At first I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was heading home. But as I drove down the quiet streets, I realized he was following me. My pulse quickened. Why was he behind me? He didn't live anywhere near my neighborhood. I knew that from dropping him off before. I tried to shake him off by taking a different route, but Joe stayed on my tail. My heart pounded as I approached my street. I couldn't let him know where I lived. Desperate, I drove past my house and took a random turn. Joe followed. I drove in circles, my mind racing. What did he want? Why was he doing this? Finally, I pulled into a stranger's driveway and turned off my headlights. Joe's car slowed as it passed, but he didn't stop. I waited until his taillights disappeared before heading home, my hands trembling on the wheel. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. My mind kept replaying the night before. I didn't know how to bring it up to anyone without sounding paranoid, so I kept it to myself. A few days later, during my break, I got a text from Joe. "Can you give me a ride to work tomorrow?" I stared at my phone, my stomach sinking. He must have gotten my number from the group chat our co-workers used. But why was he asking for a ride? He wasn't even scheduled. I showed the text to a co-worker, who frowned. "Joe doesn't work here anymore," they said. "What?" "Yeah, he got fired. Something about a fight with the manager. I think he's banned from the store." The unease I'd been feeling turned into full-blown dread. Why was he still hanging around? And why was he following me? I texted back, telling him I couldn't give him a ride, then blocked his number. Over the next few weeks, I kept an eye out for Joe whenever I worked. I never saw him again, but the memory of his car following me lingered. I left McDonald's a few months later, but the fear stayed with me. To this day, I still wonder, what was Joe's plan? Why was he so fixated on me? And what would have happened if I'd agreed to give him that last ride? It was a Saturday afternoon years ago, and I decided to grab a bite at McDonald's. Living near the city meant that weekends were always busy, crowds everywhere, lines longer than usual, and chaos in every corner. I wasn't in a rush, though. I was just craving a Big Mac, and the thought of sinking my teeth into one made the bustling restaurant worth the hassle. When I stepped inside, the scene was exactly what I expected. A madhouse. The lines stretched toward the entrance. The hum of overlapping conversations filled the air, and the employees behind the counter were scrambling to keep up. Their hands moved like a blur, assembling sandwiches, scooping fries, calling out order numbers. I joined the end of one of the lines, scanning the menu above the counter as I waited. The line moved steadily, and I found myself slowly inching forward. The smell of sizzling burgers and salty fries wafted through the air, making my hunger grow unbearable. I glanced behind me and saw more people piling into the restaurant, joining the already packed lines. Eventually, I was next to order. I took a step forward, preparing to rattle off my usual, a Big Mac, fries, and a drink. But just then, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see a man approaching, cutting through the crowd with an air of urgency. The man stopped in front of me and asked, "Hey, can I go ahead of you? I just want a water cup. I'm really thirsty." It seemed harmless enough. He looked a little disheveled, but not threatening. I figured letting him go ahead for something as simple as water wouldn't hurt. "Sure," I said with a nod, stepping back to let him in front of me. The man took his place in line, and I zoned out for a moment, letting my mind wander as I waited. The chatter of the crowd and the beeping of the kitchen equipment faded into the background. But after about 30 seconds, something snapped me back to attention. The man wasn't just asking for water. I leaned forward to listen, and my stomach sank as I realized what he was doing. He was ordering food, and not just a small meal. He was listing items off the menu like he was feeding an army. Burgers, nuggets, fries, shakes. The list went on and on. At first, I couldn't believe it. He had specifically said he only wanted a water cup. Feeling a surge of irritation, I stepped forward and tapped him on the shoulder. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked. "You said you just wanted water." He barely turned to look at me, waving me off with an exaggerated gesture. Yeah, he muttered dismissively, his attention still on the cashier. Anger flared in my chest. "Are you serious? You lied to cut in line." The man ignored me entirely, continuing to place his enormous order. He even had the audacity to look up at the menu board and ask the cashier questions about the options, dragging the process out even longer. By the time he was finally done, I was fuming. He walked away to wait for his order, and I stepped up to the counter trying to keep my composure as I gave the cashier my much simpler order. After placing my order, I moved to the waiting area and saw the man standing near the drink machine. My irritation boiled over, and I decided to confront him. Walking up to him, I said, "You told me you were just getting water. That's the only reason I let you go ahead of me." The man turned to me with a smirk. "Yeah, well, I changed my mind," he said casually. My jaw tightened. "You're unbelievable. I wouldn't have let you cut if I knew you were going to pull this." He laughed in my face, a mocking, dismissive laugh that made my blood boil. "Shut up," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. I was furious, but I knew better than to escalate things. "You're a terrible person," I said, turning to walk away, but as I walked off, I heard the sound of liquid splashing behind me. Before I could react, I felt something cold hit the back of my head. I stopped in my tracks, stunned. Slowly, I turned to see the man holding an empty drink cup, a smug grin on his face. Around us, people gasped and whispered, their eyes darting between us. My hair was wet, sticky, and dripping, and my face burned with embarrassment. I clenched my fists, wanting nothing more than to knock the smirk off his face, but I stopped myself. Getting into a fight at McDonald's wouldn't solve anything. It would only make things worse. Instead, I walked away, grabbing some napkins to dry myself off. A few people came up to me, asking if I was okay. I assured them I was, even though I felt humiliated. As I waited for my food, I noticed something that gave me a small sense of satisfaction. My order was called before his. When I walked up to grab my bag, I had to pass him. He was standing near the counter, blocking the path for others, as if he owned the place. "Look who got their order first," I said, smirking as I held up my bag. "Loser." The man glared at me but said nothing. Feeling a small sense of victory, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, eager to put the whole ordeal behind me. I made my way to my car, ready to drive home and forget about the whole mess. But just as I unlocked the door, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw the man again. My heart sank. He looked angry now, his face twisted in a scowl. "Hey!" he shouted. Before I could react, he threw what was left of his drink at my car, the liquid splashing across the windshield. Then, with a loud curse, he kicked my headlight. I froze, a mix of anger and disbelief coursing through me. He stared at me for a moment, as if daring me to respond, then turned and walked back into the McDonald's without another word. I inspected my car, my hands trembling with frustration. Thankfully, there didn't seem to be any real damage. Still, the audacity of his actions left me speechless. Getting into it with him further would only cause more problems, so I decided to leave. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove home, my mind replaying the events over and over. To this day, I still think about that bizarre encounter. What kind of person acts like that? I hope he learned a lesson somewhere along the line and decided to treat people better. But honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't. Some people are just jerks. Last year was a turning point for me in a lot of ways, though I didn't realize it at the time. One of the scariest experiences of my life began so innocently that it almost feels absurd now when I think about it. All I wanted was a stable Wi-Fi connection to finish my work. That was it. No grand plans, no elaborate adventures, just Wi-Fi. Working from home comes with its fair share of challenges, but I love the flexibility it offers. I live in a quiet apartment building close to the city, so I can step out for a walk or grab a coffee from the nearby McDonald's whenever I need a break. That day, I had a mountain of work to get through. Deadlines loomed, and I was in the zone until, out of nowhere, my Wi-Fi decided to quit on me. At first, I thought it was a temporary glitch. I restarted the router, tinkered with the settings, and tried all the usual fixes. Nothing worked. Minutes turned into an hour, and frustration mounted as I stared at my laptop, the little no internet connection icon mocking me. It was already late afternoon, and I was running out of options. I considered going to a coffee shop but dismissed the idea. The McDonald's down the street was closer, and I'd used their Wi-Fi before. Plus, it was a short walk and the fresh air might help me calm down. So I grabbed my laptop, shoved it into my bag, and headed out. The sun was starting to set, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood. The walk to McDonald's was peaceful, almost soothing, as I passed familiar sights: the tiny park with its worn benches, the corner store with the always flickering neon sign, and the quiet residential streets that led to the main road. When I arrived, the McDonald's was relatively empty, which was a pleasant surprise. I chose a booth in the back corner, away from the counter and most of the other customers. It was a little secluded, but I liked it that way. The connection was strong, and within minutes, I was lost in my work, the steady hum of the restaurant providing a strangely comforting backdrop. As the hours passed, the restaurant grew quieter. Customers came and went, the chatter and clatter of trays diminishing until, by 9 p.m., I realized I was the only one left. Even the employees seemed subdued, their voices a distant murmur behind the counter. It was time to pack up. I closed my laptop, stretched my stiff shoulders, and glanced around. The empty restaurant felt different, eerier somehow. The once familiar space now seemed cavernous and too quiet. I dismissed the feeling as a side effect of exhaustion and headed for the door. The moment I stepped outside, I noticed him. He was standing near the entrance, leaning against the wall with his hood pulled low over his face. At first glance, he looked like just another passerby, but something about his posture caught my attention. He wasn't smoking or checking his phone. He was just standing there. I glanced at him briefly, not wanting to be rude, and turned to walk in the opposite direction. My apartment was only a few blocks away, and the path was well lit. As I started walking, I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he was heading the same way. But the longer I walked, the more certain I became that he was following me. The steady rhythm of his steps mirrored mine, keeping the same distance, never closer, never farther. I resisted the urge to look back, my heart picking up speed. Instead, I quickened my pace, hoping to shake him off. But when I glanced over my shoulder, there he was, his hood still up, his face hidden in shadow. It wasn't just paranoia. He was following me. I considered my options. Turning around and confronting him felt risky. I didn't know who he was or what he wanted. My best bet was to get back to my apartment as quickly as possible. But as I approached the entrance to my complex, dread settled in my stomach. If he followed me inside, I'd be trapped. Thinking fast, I decided to take a detour. Instead of heading straight for the main entrance, I veered toward the side of the building. There was a lesser-used door there, one that required a key fob to unlock. It was a gamble. I wasn't sure if I could unlock it quickly enough, but it was my only shot. My pulse thundered in my ears as I approached the door, fumbling for my fob. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. My fingers trembled as I swiped the fob, the beep of the lock disengaging echoing like a gunshot in the quiet night. I slipped inside and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it just in time. A split second later, the handle rattled. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed my back against the door, staring at the metal handle as it jiggled futilely. He was trying to get in. Through the narrow glass panel, I could see him standing just outside, his hood still obscuring his face. He tugged at the handle again, then stepped back, staring at the door with an intensity that made my skin crawl. For what felt like an eternity, he just stood there, unmoving. Then slowly, he turned and walked away. I didn't wait to see where he went. I bolted up the stairs to my unit, locking the door behind me as soon as I was inside. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. I crept to the window in my bedroom, which overlooked the side entrance, and pulled back the curtain just a fraction. He was still there. Standing on the grass, he tilted his head back, and for the first time, I saw his face, or at least part of it. His hood still cast shadows over his features, but I could make out a crooked smirk that sent chills down my spine. And then, With deliberate slowness, he raised one hand. He flipped me off. I let the curtain fall back into place, my hands shaking as I backed away from the window. What did he want? Why had he followed me? I spent the rest of the night on edge, every creak and groan of the building making me jump. I double-checked the locks on my doors and windows, even dragging a chair in front of the door for extra security. Sleep was out of the question. The next morning, I hesitated before leaving my apartment, half expecting to see him lurking outside. But he was gone. Days turned into weeks, and I never saw him again. But the memory of that night lingers, a chilling reminder that even the most mundane trips can spiral into something terrifying. Some memories from childhood stay with you forever, etched into your mind like a vivid dream that refuses to fade. This story comes from one of those memories. It's a night I'll never forget, though I've spent years trying to make sense of it. I was around 10 or 12 years old, living with my parents in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. Or at least, that's what I thought until that night. Our house was modest but cozy, and I had my own bedroom at the back of the house overlooking the street. My room was my sanctuary, a place where I felt safe and protected from the outside world. The window in my room was my favorite feature. During the day, I'd sit by it, watching the world go by or staring at the endless sky. At night, the faint glow of a street lamp outside offered just enough light to make the room feel comforting rather than dark and oppressive. But after that night, I could never look at that window the same way again. It was an ordinary evening. My mom had made spaghetti for dinner, and afterward, I'd spent some time playing video games in the living room before heading to bed. The house was quiet as usual, the kind of calm that comes with living in a peaceful neighborhood. I crawled under my blanket, tucked myself in, and drifted off to sleep without a second thought. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. My room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Everything seemed normal, but I felt off. You know that sensation when something just doesn't feel right, even though you can't pinpoint what it is? That's how I felt. My heart was beating a little faster than usual, and there was a strange tension in the air, like the room was holding its breath. And then I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from my bedroom window. My stomach dropped. I froze, my body instinctively curling tighter under the blanket. It sounded like someone was knocking, not loud or aggressive, but deliberate. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a branch tapping against the glass? Or maybe some animal? But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those things. It was too rhythmic, too human. I didn't dare move. Instead, I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the blanket over my head, as if it could shield me from whatever was outside. My breathing was shallow, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I told myself to stay calm, that it was nothing, that it would go away. But then, a minute later, the tapping came again. Tap. Tap, tap. This time, it was louder, more insistent. My fear escalated. I wanted to scream for my parents, but something held me back. What if whoever, or whatever, was outside heard me? I was paralyzed, caught between the primal urge to run and the desperate hope that staying still would keep me safe. Minutes passed, though it felt like an eternity. The tapping stopped again, and the silence that followed was almost worse. My mind raced with terrifying thoughts. Was someone trying to break in? Were they watching me? Why my window? Finally, I summoned the courage to turn over and glance at the window. My heart was hammering so hard it hurt, and my hands were clammy as I gripped the edge of the blanket. Slowly, I shifted just enough to peek. Nothing. The window was dark, and the yard beyond was empty. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. My curiosity, or maybe my need for closure, got the better of me. I told myself I was being silly, that I needed to prove to myself it was nothing. So I sat up and tiptoed to the window. When I reached it, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the curtain, my pulse racing. What if I was wrong? What if someone really was out there? But I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that I had to look. I had to know. I pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. At first, I saw nothing. The street was empty, and the yard looked normal in the dim glow of the street lamp. But then, my eyes caught movement. At the edge of our front yard, near the sidewalk, there was a figure. My breath hitched as I focused on him. He was dressed as Ronald McDonald. The red wig, the painted face, the striped shirt, the oversized shoes. It was all there, perfectly accurate, like he'd stepped out of a commercial. But there was something deeply unsettling about him. Maybe it was the way he stood there, so still and out of place. Or maybe it was the darkness that seemed to cling to him, obscuring parts of his figure. I couldn't look away. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Was this some kind of prank? A neighborhood teenager trying to scare people? But why here? And why now? As I stared, he began to move. Slowly, almost methodically, he took a few small steps, his clown shoes making faint shuffling sounds against the grass. His movements were unnervingly deliberate, like he was putting on a performance for an unseen audience, and then he stopped. He turned his head and looked directly at me. My blood turned to ice. His painted face was smiling, but his eyes were cold and emotionless. He raised a gloved hand and waved, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. I dropped the curtain and ran out of my room, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I bolted down the hall to my parents' room, barely able to get the words out as I shook them awake. "There's someone outside! He's dressed like Ronald McDonald! He was waving at me!" My dad sat up immediately, his face a mix of confusion and concern. My mom tried to calm me down, but I was too hysterical. "He's out there. He's in the yard." My dad grabbed a flashlight and went to my room to check. I clung to my mom, trembling as we followed behind him. When we got to the window, my dad pulled the curtain aside and looked out. Nothing. The yard was empty, just as it had been before. My dad even went outside to check around the house, shining the flashlight into every corner, but he didn't find anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been there. My dad tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a bad dream, but I knew what I'd seen. My mom stayed up with me for a while, but eventually, I taped a blanket over the window, refusing to even look at it. I didn't sleep much that night, and for weeks afterward, I was jumpy every time I heard a noise outside. Even now, years later, the memory haunts me. I don't know who or what that man was or why he was there, but I do know one thing. It wasn't just a prank. It wasn't harmless. And it's a memory I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. I used to work at McDonald's during high school, and though most of my shifts were uneventful, there was one strange series of events that I've never been able to explain. It still unsettles me when I think about it. At the time, I was about 16 and living with my parents in a quiet suburb. The McDonald's where I worked was just a 5-minute drive from home, which made the job convenient. I typically worked the evening shifts, spending most of my time behind the counter taking orders. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a steady job and helped me save some extra cash. One evening, my shift started off like any other. The late afternoon was quiet, with a steady trickle of customers coming and going. Then, as usual, the dinner rush hit. The restaurant buzzed with activity. Orders were flying in, the drive-through line stretched into the parking lot, and everyone on staff was working at full tilt. After a while, things began to settle, and by around 8 o'clock, the restaurant had quieted down significantly. I was at the counter, taking an order from a customer, when something unusual caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone walk into the restaurant. A woman. At first, I didn't think much of it. She seemed like any other customer coming in for a late dinner. She walked in slowly, wearing a plain outfit, jeans and a hoodie, nothing particularly remarkable. But instead of getting in line behind the customer I was helping, she did something strange. She pulled out her phone, raised it, and pointed it in my direction. The flash didn't go off, but I knew right away that she had just taken a picture of me. I froze, startled by how blatant it was. She didn't try to hide what she was doing. If anything, it seemed like she wanted me to notice. Before I could say anything, she put her phone down, turned around, and walked out of the restaurant just as quickly as she had come in. The customer I was helping noticed my reaction and asked me what had happened. I hesitated, still processing what I'd just seen, and then I told her, "I think that woman just took a picture of me." The customer turned to look, but by then, the woman was already out the door. We both agreed it was weird, but the customer shrugged it off and finished placing her order. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why would someone walk into a McDonald's, take a picture of me, and then leave without ordering anything? I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe she had mistaken me for someone else or that it was some kind of harmless joke. But the encounter left me feeling uneasy for the rest of my shift. A few days later, I was back at work for another evening shift. It was another quiet night, similar to the one before. I wasn't taking anyone's order this time, just standing behind the counter, restocking napkins and sipping my soda when the door opened. And there she was. At first, I didn't recognize her. She walked in with the same deliberate slowness as before, and for a moment I thought she was just another customer. But as soon as she took a few steps inside, it hit me. This was the same woman who had taken my picture days earlier. My chest tightened as she reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone and raised it again. This time, I spoke up. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice firmer than I expected. She didn't answer. She snapped the picture, lowered her phone and turned to leave, just like before. I tried calling out to her again, but she didn't respond. She moved quickly, slipping out the door before I could react. My coworkers noticed the commotion and asked me what was going on. I explained what had happened, and they exchanged confused glances. "Maybe she's stalking you," one of them joked, but the comment didn't sit well with me. For the rest of the shift, I kept glancing toward the door, half expecting her to come back. But she didn't. The night ended, and I went home, still uneasy but trying to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence. A week later, I came home from school to find a letter waiting for me on the kitchen table. My mom had picked it up from the mailbox and handed it to me with a curious look. "You got mail," she said. The envelope had no return address, and the handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. I opened it cautiously, my heart sinking as I pulled out 2 photographs. They were the pictures the woman had taken of me at McDonald's. The first one was from the night she had walked in while I was taking an order. It was a candid shot, showing me standing behind the counter, mid-conversation with a customer. The second was from the second encounter, where I had caught her in the act. In both pictures, my expression was tense and confused. There was no note inside the envelope, no explanation, no context, nothing. Just the photos. I showed the pictures to my mom, who was just as baffled as I was. "Who sent these?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. I told her about the woman and the strange encounters at work. My dad, who had overheard the conversation, suggested that I show the pictures to my manager. The next time I worked, I brought the photos with me and explained everything to my boss. He looked just as confused as I felt. "That's definitely weird," he said, frowning at the pictures. "Did you recognize her? Is she a regular?" I shook my head. Number, I've never seen her before these incidents. We went over the security footage from the nights in question, but the cameras didn't capture much. They showed the woman entering the restaurant, taking the pictures and leaving, but there was nothing to indicate who she was or why she was doing it. After that, I never saw her again. She didn't come back to the restaurant, and no more pictures showed up in the mail. The whole thing became a strange, unsettling mystery, one I still think about from time to time. Who was she? Why was she taking pictures of me? Was it some kind of prank, or did she have some darker reason? I'll probably never know, but to this day, I can't shake the eerie feeling that there was more to it than I'll ever understand.